Hi, so today I want to talk about the concept of submission in the church. Now, it's a bit of a hot potato, and I've seen a fair bit of noise on social media about it recently. People talking about the concept of submission. Is it good? Is it bad? What does it look like? So, I want to look at a bit of a background of submission, what it means, why people are reacting to it right now, and try and quickly look at a biblical way forward in the concept. Now, before I continue, I think we just need to clarify what we mean by submission. Now, simply put, the idea of submission is just following the guidance of another person. Now, the word itself can have negative connotations as well, because people sometimes think that submission can mean forcing someone into submission. Think of like a wrestler would force another wrestler to submit. Now, that's not what we mean when we talk about submission in the church, or at least it shouldn't be. Submission in the church context is something we do voluntarily. That's where we accept the authority of someone else to guide us in decisions about life. And we always have the choice in this situation of simply not doing what we're asked or advised to do. And we'll come back to that a bit later. Now, that doesn't mean that even if we do as we've been asked to do, that we necessarily like or agree with it. But we've made a choice to follow it. If we don't have a choice, then we're actually doing things under duress, and that's not really submission. Now, maybe there are times where we feel coerced to do things against our will and feel like we've got no choice in the matter, but that isn't the topic of submission. That's something a bit different. Maybe we can talk about the rights and wrongs of that another time, and when that might or might not be a good or a bad thing. So in summary, in the introduction here, we're talking about voluntarily submitting ourselves to the guidance of another person with decisions we bring to that person or that group of people. I'm going to come later to the biblical reasons for submission and what I think good submission can look like. But before that, I just want to talk quickly about some of the objections that people have to the principle of submission in the church. I want to do it that way round, just so we can see specifically what the answers to those concerns are later. So I'd split the objections, or certainly the objections I want to talk about now, into two broad categories. The first is the argument from personal freedom or faith, and the second is the argument of abuse of authority. So firstly, the argument from personal freedom or faith. Now, people who object to submission on these grounds say that God is the ultimate authority. He's put the Holy Spirit inside each one of us to guide us in our walk. We're all part of the priesthood of believers, 1 Peter 5. So submitting to man, in this argument, is to put man in the place of God. And so surely, according to this perspective, we're all to follow God alone and not subject ourselves to any man. That's how it goes. Now that appeals to us in this postmodern age, this idea, because we're told it's all about us, right? So this is a very self-centric view. It's us and God, and no one else has any authority over us. It's us and God. We can figure it out between us. Now, there's an element of truth there in that men should never take the place of God. I am aware of a church organization that teaches that if a leader tells you to do something in sin, then the penalty for that sin falls on the leader and not on you. For example, this is obviously bad, right? Because now you're elevating man far above what is healthy. Yes, leaders do need to give an account to us for God. That's Hebrews 13:17. But every one of us has to give an account for our own actions in front of God as well. So yes, we do answer to God. There has to be an individual relationship between us and God. But does that necessarily mean that we never submit to man? We'll come back to that. Secondly, we've got the argument of abuse of authority. And often people arguing from this perspective will point to things like the heavy shepherding movement of the 70s and 80s. In essence, what started out in these, it was a desire for greater accountability for each other. Iron sharpens iron, that we do things together, we rebuke each other and love each other. But the problem is that what started out actually as a very noble idea, it grew to become a system, an authoritarian system, where all the decisions were made based on this structure, and often it became less spirit-led, more human-led, because it was a system. There was very personal viewpoints would influence decisions, and so leaders were basically deciding every aspect of the life of the people that were beneath them, if you like. Adherence to the system was like a prerequisite for acceptance in the system, and everything became scarily close to the idea of coercion. So it was a top-down rather than a bottom-up approach. Rather than people voluntarily submitting, people were being coerced into following the diktats of the system. In addition, you can see that this became unhealthy because the leadership became kind of above any reproach themselves. Often, not in every church, but in many churches that followed this kind of shepherding movement to a great degree, it became quite unhealthy, and then eventually, ultimately, it kind of collapsed in itself. The problem is when man makes a system, even if it's out of noble ideals, even if there's an element of truth in the original idea, if we make a system out of it, it will fail. But just because the system failed when it became a mankind top-down system, does that mean we should never submit to man? So there are some objections, and I have to say there's an element of truth in those objections. So what does biblical submission look like? Is it a thing? Well, before I carry on, I just need to make clear that biblical submission is a thing. We should submit to man, not only to God, but to man as well. I'm going to quote Hebrews 13:17. I mentioned it just now, and the verse says this: "Have confidence in your leaders and submit to their authority, because they keep watch over you as those who must give an account. Do this so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no benefit to you." So we should have confidence in our leaders and submit to them. Sure, so it's definitely biblical that we submit not just to God, but to those he places over us. And you only need to read Paul's letters in the New Testament, and you'll see that he's constantly nurturing and exhorting and directing and encouraging and chastising and all these things with the churches that he looks after. He never forces obedience. In fact, he pleads with the churches to hear his heart and to follow what he teaches. It's actually not top-down forcing. It's bottom-up asking, saying, will you submit to this? Will you hear me? Will you follow? He was asking for submission. And that's where health is found. But that was Paul, and that's the New Testament. What does it look like for us where that health can be found? And I want to look at it in two parts: leaders and those who are being led. Okay, so firstly, I just want to talk quickly about leaders in a healthy model of submission. So one of the reasons the shepherding movement broke down is because it placed too high a view on leadership, in terms of the leaders almost became above others. They didn't recognize the inherent brokenness in all of us as much as they should. The truth is this: leaders need to submit to each other and to God, just as we submit to each other and to God. They're saints, just like all of us, and they need to submit as well. In fact, if we read the next verse in Hebrews 13, it says this: "Pray for us. We are sure that we have a clear conscience and desire to live honorably in every way." So this is the leaders that just said, have confidence and submit to your leaders, and we're going to ask you for submission, and we're also going to ask for your prayers. Because they need prayer too. Their desire was to live holy and honourable lives, and that's what leaders should be. If they ask for submission, they should also be in submission. They have to be just as accountable as anyone else. In fact, I would say more accountable than anyone else, because they're going to get attacked all the more by the enemy. So if you're in a church where you're being asked to submit by a leader who's clearly not in submission themselves, my advice would be run. Just run. Don't be in a place where you're being asked to submit by someone who's not in submission. That is going to get toxic very soon. Find a church where the leaders submit to each other, where they openly confess when they're in error. And what about us, those who are maybe have some degree of leadership, but we're also in submission. We're being led by somebody. How do we submit to our leaders? Well, we should make it easy for them. Make it clear to them in the things we say, things we do, that we follow their guidance, that we value their guidance, that we have confidence in them, as it says in Hebrews. And if you want to make it easier for them and for you, and to make the guidance better, then accountability goes hand in hand with submission. So accountability means that share your struggles and desires with your leaders. Let them know the things that are on your heart, and then they will better be able to speak into your lives because they'll know where you're coming from. You'll have a bridge of trust and understanding and openness between you. Now, in practice, sometimes this will seem pretty painless because the leaders might ask you to do something, you want to do it anyway. Great. It seems like submission is really easy. I've got some bad news for you though. That's not submission, that's just agreement. You see, submission happens when we do something that we don't want to do, when we're asked to do something we don't maybe agree with. I was challenged once by someone who I was talking to them about submission and the concept of biblical submission, and they said, yeah, but what if your leaders ask you to do something you think it's the wrong decision? Surely you shouldn't submit then. But that's the very point of submission, is when someone's seeing something differently to me and I choose to submit to their leadership rather than my own judgment on these things. Now, there might be a time when I'm asked to do something that I believe is sinful, and obviously I still account to God first, right? So it would be wrong for me just to blindly sin and blame my leaders. But if it's not a matter of sin, if it's just a matter of guidance, then yes, submission is doing something that maybe we don't agree with. Now, I've had to learn this because I'm someone who sees things very much in terms of right and wrong, but God had to teach me that it's not always about being right. It's actually about being obedient. Think of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, the son of the promise. Now, was sacrificing his son the right thing to do? Did it make any sense? Well, no. Everything about it seemed wrong. But God asked him to do that because he was interested in seeing whether Abraham would be obedient. And God has asked me to submit to my leaders to be obedient. And so if I obey God, I obey my leaders. Now, of course, this does raise one final tricky question, which is, okay, so I should submit things to my leaders and obey my leaders. So what parts of our lives should we be submitting to the leaders? Now, I've heard it said that we should be submitting things that are in our spiritual walk, but that our day-to-day practical lives are between us and God. So, church, submitted to leaders, and everything else is not. So if that's the case, I've got a question. What parts of our lives are not spiritual? What do we do every day that has no bearing at all on our walk with God, our witness, or our ministry? Are there parts of our life where God is not part of it? Are we unspiritual at work? Is the place that we choose to live unspiritual? Is that something that God's not got a part of that? The reality is that if we love Jesus, then every part of our lives should be open to him and to those he's placed over us. Our finances, our homes, our jobs, our relationships, everything, because all of these things will impact the kingdom and how we walk in the kingdom. Now, we don't need to get silly about it. I mean, if you call your leader to ask if you should be buying cornflakes or Rice Krispies, he's probably going to get pretty irritated with you because that's not going to affect your walk, right? Some decisions you can just make yourself. But if something that matters in life, something that will affect your walk, take it to your leaders. Now, it might be they simply tell you, well, this is something between you and God, decide for yourselves, between you and God, what the right, the wrong thing to do is in this circumstance. And that's fine, that's okay. But at least you've made yourself available. You've made it easy for your leaders because you've shown them that you're in submission. And over time, we'll figure out what kind of things we should or shouldn't be submitting. If in doubt, submit it. Remember, when all is said and done, Jesus modeled submission for us. As he said to God the Father before he's crucified, yet not my will, but yours be done. If this is truly our heart's desire, that we want to follow God, then God has asked us to follow those he's placed over us. And if we do that, then we will be following Jesus' example.